Number 10. Playing sports with himself. So the Flash will sometimes use his abilities to entertain others. And well, sometimes that can get a little silly. So in the story The Flash of Two Worlds from 1961, the Flash ends up visiting Earth 2, and he meets the Golden Age Flash. This is after he vibrates his molecules in a way that he has never done before, hence introducing the world to the concept of the multiverse in comics. Something that would change everything. That's all legit. What we're here to talk about is how at an orphan's benefit at the start of the story, before he vanishes, he entertains an auditorium full of kids by playing tennis with himself. Now, of course the Flash could do this, but how entertaining for the kids would it be? Wouldn't he be moving too fast to really see? It would be like that race from the boys, just over in a blip. But you're just glad to be there, cause the Flash, hooray. Number 9. The Flash can change his appearance. So this is an ability that the Flash used in the Silver Age, so we're talking about Barry Allen, as he is the Silver Age Flash. He used to be able to reshape his molecules, cause super speed. And he would even be able to reshape and mold his face like putty, which was a very useful ability, but one that kinda takes him outside his whole speed gimmick. Fastest man alive, also able to move his face. A hero who can look like anyone to infiltrate areas is a much different vibe than someone who's just super fast. Also, that type of ability tends to be more applied to villains, since it is more clandestine, and that can more easily be used for villainy. Superman was also able to do this at one point, but only on a rare occurrence. The Silver Age was like this though. The idea of extended continuity that included everything, so you would have to, branch them all together, well, that was coming and still being developed. So you would have a bunch of one-shot powers that happen once and never again. Number 8. Throwing lightning. So the Flash, Barry Allen, and Wally West initially got their powers by being struck by lightning and covered in chemicals. Take that, Jay Garrick and Hard Water. Lightning has always been a part of the Flash's motif though, down to his very costume. And later, as more and more of the Speed Force was revealed, a lot of it would manifest in a way very similar to lightning, or just as lightning. So it was that Wally 2, Wallace West, the Wally of the New 52 and beyond, when they erased first Wally because Dan Didio hates him, he would be able to harness that energy of the Speed Force and push it out through his hands as lightning. Now, this was a more controversial ability, because it's essentially energy powers, and again, that's a bit outside the wheelhouse of being the fastest. I mean, you're already fast and you get to throw energy to boot on top of all of that? That's a lot. For some, it was too much. Also, for some, anything Wallace did was too much. Poor Wally too. He's okay. His introduction to the DC universe was rough. Who greenlit that? But so is a lot of the New 52.
And at number 7, we have Black Condor. There have been 3 Black Condors over the years, and all 3 haven't had great origin stories, but let's specifically look at the first, Richard Grey Jr. First appearing in Crack Comics issue 1 in 1940, Grey got his powers thanks to nuclear exposure from a radioactive meteor. Despite this, he personally believed that this wasn't actually the reason he had gotten powers. This is because he believed he was capable of flight because he had been raised as an orphan by a flock of wild condor birds in the wild. In the wilderness. Which, yes, is very, very dumb. When he did return to civilized society, he just happened upon the dead body of a senator named Thomas Wright. So he stole his identity because they shared an uncanny resemblance. How convenient. And yes, he led a double life as a senator while operating as a crime fighter. Yeah, you can see why this character has had so many different iterations. Although they never, quite got it right. Up next at 6, Green Arrow. Green Arrow's initial origin story is so bad because it's laughable. And that's because it is literally a ripoff of another one of DC's more popular characters, Batman. First appearing in More Fun Comics issue 73 from 1941, DC was clearly trying to capitalize on the success of their Caped Crusader Batman by creating a similar hero. This hero was Oliver Queen. Queen was an orphan. Queen had a traumatic experience that inspired him to fight crime. Queen was a millionaire philanthropist playboy. Queen had an arrow cave and an arrow car and even a young ward. Spot the difference yet? Well, apparently Queen found himself on a deserted island one day and taught himself how to be an expert archer. This is literally the only difference between him and Bruce Wayne when you put it out on paper. Like Batman, but more Robin Hood. Luckily, Queen had become a more independent character in terms of his identity later on, having had a major overhaul and a neat little retcon in the 60s that mixed up his ideologies, ditched his millionaire background, and turned him into a liberal man fighting for the people. Let's move on to another iconic DC character in at number 5, Catwoman. Oh yes, an iconic character the caliber of Catwoman can be victimized by a terribly wacky origin story just like any other hero. Selina Kyle first hit the scene in the early days of the Golden Age, appearing in Batman issue 1 from 1940, but she hadn't fully come into her own yet. During her debut, she was merely an expert thief who made use of disguises that made her appear like an innocent elderly woman. But how did she enter this glamorous life of crime and jewel thievery? Well, once upon a time, she was a flight attendant, and during one fateful flight, the plane she was working on crashed. She suffered from amnesia as a result, and upon waking, what did she do? She decided that she should start a life of crime. That's a completely rational idea, right? Yeah. Let's just be criminals. As for the whole cat part of her persona, she chose to adopt the mantle of the cat. She wouldn't be called Catwoman until later on, all due to her daddy dearest having owned a pet store in the past. As you can imagine, DC being the king of reboots and retcons eventually retconned this origin and replaced it with a brand new one in the 1980s after the character had made a comeback in the Silver Age. In our number 4 spot, Shanna the She-Devil. Shanna first appeared in a self-titled comic book in 1972. She is a well-trained veterinarian, an Olympic-level athlete, experienced in combat, and has extraordinary agility. She's also a highly sexually objectified character, but that is not why she landed on this list. Shanna witnessed the death of her mother. Her father murdered her mother. Yikes. She then moved from her home in Africa and came to the US to become an Olympic level athlete and a vet who specialized in raising leopard cubs. Here's where it gets really random. One of the cubs that she was raising was shot at by a zoo guard, and feeling the need to protect wildlife better, she moved back to Africa to fight poachers. That's it. It's kinda boring. Cool story. I can tell it again if you'd like.
Number 3. One Punch. So the Flash can use his speed and the Speed Force to amplify a bunch of abilities. So he can also channel this speed and energy into one meta powered punch. A dangerous, potentially life-ending blow that is supposedly guaranteed to end most average villains. Not kill them, just end the fight. Even if they are metas themselves. Sometimes people call this the ultimate punch. And well, it's very much maybe a one-hit KO type deal, or a we need the big guns kind of deal, so it doesn't happen too often. But when it does, it raises the question. So can't he just channel the energy into himself and be all around stronger, kinda on average? See, sometimes a less than stellar power makes you question the character's other abilities. Also, the fact that the Flash isn't the strongest is part of what makes him interesting, because he needs to find other solutions for his extremely strong foes. Number 2. Constructs. Now when you hear the word constructs, your mind may go, oh, Green Lantern. But no, by using the Speed Force, the Flash too can create solid constructs and objects. Objects he can then use. How does he do this? Well, fans are still arguing about it, bandying about terms like speed and light, and if we got them at the right vibrational speed, sure, it could be solid. While others say, why could he be able to do that? That's too much power. Now the Flash phasing through things, legit, but then turning around and making things solid, is it supposed to be because they were intangible? And vibrating them into phase? Maybe. I mean, I guess if we don't get too deep, which is fine. Nobody should be learning their science from the comic book universe. And if media can still tell the world that you only use part of the percentage of your brain, then the Flash can make things solid. That's the deal. Because that's not true. Number 1. Strength Force. This gem comes to us from the Rebirth era of the Flash and introduces us to the concept of the Strength Force. So in the Flash number 53, the Flash is infused with the Strength Force. And then we got to experience really jacked up Hulkberry in 54. And yeah, it definitely is an experience. There's a bunch of monologuing about how different the Strength Force is. It's different than the Speed Force, it's heavier. He also uses it to talk about how he can't just think his way out of every situation, despite how fast he's able to think. The Strength Force is ludicrous, and they try to make more of it than just roids, because Barry is all, it's more than just muscles, I can control gravity, because he's so dense. Thankfully, this is very short-lived, and he shrinks back down to regular Barry Allen. But the Strength Force was definitely deserving of our number 1, because it makes you question everything.
Starting us off in at number 10, the Badger. Let's begin our list with one of the more obscure heroes to appear on our countdown today. We are talking Norbert Sykes, aka the Badger. Oh friends, it only gets worse from here. So our buddy Norbert is a Vietnam vet who was initially published by the very short-lived Capital Comics. His rights then went to a publisher called First Comics, and then after the 90s he was released by Dark Horse, Image, and IDW. So yeah, he's been around a lot. Wonder why. First appearing in a self-titled comic, Badger issue 1 in 1983, this is a character who is an expert martial artist. And, this is the best part, he can talk to animals. So, how did he get that power? Well, we should probably preface this by noting that he has multiple personality disorder, because one of his personalities believed he could talk to animals, and that personality referred to itself as the Badger. Oh, and it's also worth noting that this persona of his believed he saw God appear as a badger to him. Yeah, like I said, gets worse. Norbert escapes the mental asylum that he's in and becomes a vigilante based off of this. He's also got a ton of other personalities too, including a dog, a 9-year-old girl, a playboy, and an inner city black kid. So not only is this absurd, it's also a little bit offensive too. It wasn't even the Silver Age, you guys. Well, actually, the more racially offensive age was the Golden Age. But. Up next, number 9, Defensor. The Defensor is another slightly obscure character, and he has a very obscure origin story to boot. Defensor first appeared in Marvel's Superhero Contest of Champions issue 1 in 1982. Before becoming a vigilante, he was a construction worker named Gabriel Carlo Dantes Sepulveda, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. Gabriel found an underground passageway that he snuck into after superiors at his job had gone home for the day. They had previously told him to ignore his discovery. Super stubborn though, he entered and found that the cavern contained a suit of vibranium armor connected to an unknown machine. So what did Gabriel do? Well, he put it on, of course. And as soon as he did, things went to hell. He was attacked by a group of creatures, and he fought his way back to the surface, and thus began his vigilante career. His death happened off-panel in 1995, being reported in Captain America issue 442, so clearly wasn't all that important. Makes sense why he's obscure. Coming in at our next spot at number 8, Elongated Man. Ralph Dibny may be a more respected B-tier superhero these days, but that is not something you'd assume based solely off of his origin story. How did he become a superhero? He drank soda. Not even kidding here. Dibny, a young regular dude who just so happened to be obsessed with circus performers, wanted to be like the contortionists and acrobats that he so dearly admired. So he did his research and asked around, and turns out the particular performers he questioned claimed that they drank a particular kind of carbonated beverage that helped them stay in top form. That soda was a drink called Gingold. So what does our pal Ralph do? Well, he went out and bought as much Gingold as he could get his non-powered hands on, and he drank it. A lot of it. Like an unsafe amount of it. And surprise surprise, it actually worked, but gave him more than he bargained for. He had gained stretchy powers capable of elongating his body in any which way. Now you're probably thinking this story has some obvious plot holes, right? Can anyone drink a bunch of pop and be granted superpowers? Definitely not. Really, he's lucky that he didn't gain a massive amount of cavities instead. In at number 7, Super Imagination. Unfortunately, this is not what it sounds like. Super Imagination was the name given to an ability of Clark's that was initially called telescopic vision. This occurred thanks to a reprint of a story that appeared in Superman Annual issue 2. So what exactly is Super Imagination? It's his ability to look back through time. And his use of it was even more absurd. Superman used his super imagination to send a giant ape named Titano, who shot kryptonite from its eyes back to prehistoric times. He also created special lead sunglasses for the ape so he would stop shooting kryptonite out of his eyes. That was a sentence. Moving on to number 6, Telekinesis. During John Byrne's run on Superman, the Man of Steel had a new power added to his roster. Telekinesis, the ability to move things with his mind. Now, according to the creator, this enabled Superman's ability to fly. Apparently, Superman flying was a form of self-telekinesis in which an invisible force field engulfed him and caused him to float. In addition to this, the telekinesis power also apparently explained his invulnerability, somehow. As if that wasn't bad enough, the concept was adopted by the 1987 film adaptation Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. A telekinetic beam shoots out of the hero's eyes, lifting people off of the ground. He then uses it to repair the Great Wall of China. To be fair, that Saga Superman film adaptations gave him a slew of really odd powers that generally faded into obscurity altogether, so wouldn't think much of it. Moving on to number 5, Telepathy. In a 1947 issue of Superman, number 45, Clark finds himself going up against aliens called the Collectors in a story titled The Case of the Living Trophies. Now this alien race's whole shtick is collecting notable people, which apparently includes Lois Lane, so naturally Superman seeks them out and investigates all of their disappearances. He ends up getting captured by the Collectors but uses telepathy in order to force his captor to free him, communicating with this alien without even uttering a word. Apparently this is something all Kryptonians can do, according to the second appearance of this ability in the Lois and Clark television series. Speaking of this wacky comic issue though, that brings us to our next number, And at 4, he can shapeshift. If you thought busting out telepathy powers was something special, hold up, because Superman outdoes himself with another power in that very same issue. After Superman breaks free of his captivity, he shapeshifts into a collector himself, and it's actually really kind of scary how he does it. He impersonates them, tricks the other collectors, and then rescues their human captives and uses a dimension traveling device to return home. How the hell did he shapeshift? Why hasn't he used this power before? And why did he never use it again? Well, I think we can all assume the answer to that last question, since this is the only time he has ever pulled that stunt. Up next, my personal favorite on this, coming in our number 3 spot, we have Bouncing Boy. Oh, Bouncing Boy. Bouncing Boy is by far one of the silliest superheroes out there. He is a boy who has the power to inflate like a giant ball, and of course, bounce around. It also gives him a certain extent of invulnerability, to be fair. He first appeared in Action Comics issue 276 in 1961, and he was a part of the Legion of Superheroes. Bouncing Boy, aka Chuck Tane, is largely thought to be a character created by Jerry Siegel as a means of reflecting Siegel's interest in comedy and a desire to have a vehicle for humor on that team. So how did Chuck get his powers? Well, he was not born with them. And silly enough, he is the second individual on our list to gain powers from a beverage. No word of a lie, Chuck thought he was gulping down a delicious soda when in fact he had just consumed a super plastic formula, whatever that is. He was first rejected by the Legion, but after defeating a robber, he was accepted onto the team's roster and became the Legion's self-appointed, I quote, morale officer. Morale officer? I mean, like, morale, like, inspirer would make sense, but to be an officer is kind of seems like he's bouncing around being like, be happy, you know? Moving on to something even more ridiculous, in at number 2, Firebrand. The Firebrand mantle has been held by 2 individuals, siblings Rod and Danette Riley. Rod Riley was a bored, wealthy socialite who decided he would fight crime alongside his manservant, donning a very flamboyant costume that consisted of a transparent shirt and tight red pants. Now, aside from being a bit of a latent queer superhero, Rod was pretty damn racist. His story had eventually been retconned, making him present at Pearl Harbor during its attack in World War II. So I guess it's justified racism? Ew. No thanks. Danette, after finding out her brother was Firebrand, would state, I quote, "What a confirmed bachelor playboy like my brother needed with a bodyguard, I never understood." And even better, from the looks of these clothes, I didn't know my brother quite well as I thought I did. In other words, sweetie, your brother's gay. Speaking of, her origin was a bit more absurd than her brother's. She was studying volcanoes north of Hawaii in the 40s when she was kidnapped by a sorcerer named Wotan. When she tried to escape, Wotan hit her with a magical blast that knocked her into a pit of lava, which then gave her the power to control heat and shoot fire blasts. Which, you know, seems a little absurd because if one was to be thrown into a pit of lava, you would die pretty quickly. Wouldn't be fun. But there is magic involved, so it's fine. And finally, in our number 1 spot, the Whizzer. The Whizzer, aka Robert Frank, is the product of the Golden Age, having initially been published by Marvel's predecessor, Timely Comics. First debuting in US Comics issue 1 in 1941, the Whizzer not only has a silly name, his origin story is almost baffling. It's that bad. Born in St. Louis, Missouri, Robert Frank was a fellow who went on a trip to Africa with his father. That was where he was bitten by a cobra. An almost fatal bite, his father saved him at the last minute with a blood transfusion from a mongoose. Why? Apparently to counteract the poison. But because of this, Robert was given super speed abilities. Later on, writers tried to make more sense of this by saying that the mongoose blood actually triggered latent metahuman abilities. Yeah. Sure, right. That makes way more sense. Totally. And that's why he fell into obscurity. Starting us off in at number 10, he can clone himself. Once upon a time, Superman made a duplicate of himself. And this wasn't even initially a product of the Silver Age. This actually happened in the 90s. And the 60s, which is the Silver Age. Oh, and also the 30s, which is the Golden Age. Okay, let's backtrack for a sec. In 1963, there was a story in which, due to proximity to red kryptonite, Superman was split into 2 versions, Superman Red and Superman Blue. Now this happened when Superman is hooked up to a brain machine, which accidentally duplicates him. This story was later adapted in 1998 in a storyline called Superman Red and Superman Blue, in which Superman had developed energy-based abilities. Now to be fair, this actually happened before, back in the Golden Age in the live-action Adventures of Superman series, when he split himself in half in order to save himself and Lois from an old collapsed mine shaft that they were stuck in. But still, that was 1938, we can give them some leeway. The 90s though? not really an excuse for that, DC. In at number 9, the Superman diet. Oh, the Silver Age. Superman's Silver Age legacy has left us with a bunch of wonderfully dumb comic book covers and plots. Case in point, this issue of Action Comics number 454, in which Superman is shoveling burgers into his mouth while shouting in between bites, "More burgers! Keep them coming or I'll starve to death!" He's also hunched over like he's taking a dump on a camping trip in the forest. It's pretty great. So what exactly is going on here? In multiple iterations of the superhero, the Man of Steel has stated that he receives all the energy he needs from the sun rather than needing food for sustenance. It's thanks to his Kryptonian physiology. But sometimes he eats to fit in, or just because he wants to. And in this case, we see him in need of more energy thanks to Toyman siphoning off his strength. Not only did this weaken Superman, but he felt like he was starving, hence eating all of those burgers as a means of countering Toyman's device. While this power hasn't officially been retconned, it sure has not been revisited. Side note, the cover of this issue also has a burger joint restaurant in the background that has 3 golden arches. In at number 8, phasing through matter. In The Death of Superman, a story arc some of you know I have serious beef with, Superman and Doomsday punch each other to death and a whole ridiculous story arc is spawned from it, inevitably ruining the concept of death in comics. Let's leave it at that for now. Years later, in Superman issue 175, the Man of Steel found himself coming face to face with Doomsday yet again. And what does he do? He phases through Doomsday's punches. Come on, DC! What the hell? Apparently this is a similar ability to what the Flash has, where he moves so fast and vibrates his molecules so that he can phase through objects and individuals. The real kicker though? Superman possessed phasing powers back in 1958 in an episode of Adventures of Superman. Guess DC just ignored that altogether. Guess they can just create powers when necessary and take them away when they want to turn a profit. Sorry, getting a little salty over here. Let's move on to something a little bit more lighthearted.
Number 7, fast talker. The Flash, if he forgets, will talk at the same pace he thinks, which is incredibly fast. In fact, he can talk at a speed so fast he can only be understood by other speedsters. Now the fast talking is a cute character trait, and it makes sense. But it also raises a very depressing conundrum, the likes of which is explored by songs such as The Ballad of Barry Allen. And that is the Flash okay? The Flash is such a happy, well-adjusted hero, but this ability really makes you think, how slow must everybody else seem to him? How does he stand it without snapping? And how does he form meaningful connections when he could have finished a whole conversation while you're just finishing a sentence? It also feels like he would constantly have to be thinking about this. You would think he would forget this more often. Then you start to think, should he come across as more jittery? Cause even a slight movement from him would come across like a really quick jerk to somebody else. Just us regular slow folks. See, it's opened up a whole other world and it's kinda sad. Number 6, mimicking voices. Staying on the path of voices, the Flash can vibrate his vocal cords to the point where he can sound like absolutely anybody. Now this would be an extremely useful ability, and it's one that if you extrapolate, yeah, it makes sense I guess. However, why wouldn't he use this all the time? It would be an advantage in so many situations, confuse enemies and allies alike. And that's the thing. It's too good. This ability, like some of the others, is a huge advantage, and also a little more on the villainous side of things. Still, this is an ability I would actually like to see more of, and I'm not averse to a darker Barry. It's just hilarious when Grant Gustin tries to do it. Floppy emo hair. Number 5, expert folder. Okay, this is never overtly stated, but think about it. For years, the Flash has kept his costume inside a ring and then shoots it out and changes into it at super speed. This is when he needs it, but how does he get it back inside the ring? Because he does. And this usually joke, oh, he can. But you know what? No. Super folder, super speed expert folder. They say that the costume is sucked back into the ring by special gas when the ring is opened. Okay, sure, Jan. Just admit it, he folds it super fast where no one can see. He just has a really impractical method of storing it. You're the Flash, you could just keep it anywhere and run and change into it and still be back in time to stop whatever crime is happening. We believe in you. Number 4, Speed Scout duplicates. So the Flash can create duplicates of himself that he can send forward and back in time. Sometimes they're duplicates, sometimes they're versions of himself from a few seconds or minutes in the past or future. Either way, it gets weird if you think about it too hard. Communicating with yourself a minute or two from now and then telling yourself what to do, it just seems disconcerting. And how do the timeline effects ripple out? Is this how the universe ends? Barry telling his past self to remember to buy milk so he can have cereal when he gets home? Barry would totally have cereal for dinner. You know it. When you start dealing with time travel and Barry, it can get messy, especially since he doesn't need his fancy treadmill anymore. I miss the cosmic exercise equipment. It still pops up here and there, but they take it far too seriously.
This list in at 3, super dancing. Oh. In the 1979 Superman Family issue 196, in a story titled Private Life of Clark Kent, Super Disco Fever, Clark is taken to a disco club forcefully by his fan club. It is worth noting that this fan club is a Clark Kent fan club, not a Superman fan club, the product of him being a news anchor at the Daily Planet building for the WGBS TV flagship television station. While judging a dance contest, he discovers that the bar is about to be bombed thanks to his X-ray vision. So what does he do? He decides to bust out some kick-ass disco moves, which vibrates the floor enough to damage the explosives trigger mechanism. The best part is, as he's shaking his booty, which it quite literally says on panel, we get to read his thought bubbles that state, "I saw enough of dancing before to pick up the basics." So apparently this is the first time that Clark has ever done any disco moves, and he's amazing, and the crowd's like, oh my god, and he saves the day. Oh, gotta love the Private Life of Clark Kent stories. So good. Up next at number 2, Mini Superman. Once upon a time, in Superman issue 125, the Man of Steel exhibited a particularly ridiculous and extremely memorable superpower that is so very characteristic of the Silver Age of comic books. In a story titled Superman's New Power, Superman encounters a strange alien ship that explodes on contact with him. His powers are altered, with all but flight and invulnerability removed. All of his other powers are replaced with an ability that lets him shoot out a miniature version of himself, called a Superman proxy, out of his fingers. Thus begins a crazy plot in which Superman starts to use his mini-me to do all of the hard work while he enjoys the perks of being a superhero. If this wasn't silly enough, the story takes it one step further, with Superman actually becoming jealous of his Superman proxy, who was starting to get all of the press attention. What? So what does Superman do? The only thing he can do. He lets the proxy sacrifice itself when a group of criminals try to kill Superman with a chunk of kryptonite. And with his mini-me dead, all of his regular powers return. This was an actual story, published in 1958. And last but not least, in at number 1, the Kryptonian healing coma. I am sorry, I had to. You know how earlier on we mentioned that whole phasing ability that managed to make the absurdity of the Death of Superman arc even totally more absurd? Well, this is how the Death of Superman arc was actually resolved. DC didn't kill off the Man of Steel, rather he just looked dead. Yeah, he had fallen into something coined as a Kryptonian coma, a healing coma that only Kryptonians are capable of, which can nurture them back to health even if they're near death. Of course, this outraged fans, and me, who called DC out on their story arc that clearly was trying to capitalize on hype and turn a profit, and inevitably ruin the concept of death in comic books. I promise I won't rant about it any more than that.